This oral history of museum computing is provided by Greg Albers and was recorded on the 29th of March, 2021 by Paul Marty and Kathy Jones.
So I'm Greg Albers. I'm currently the digital publications manager at Getty in Los Angeles. So my history in museums really started coming in from as a print book publisher. Actually, that's how I first came to museums. I was looking to do book publishing, and I started the MFA Boston. Just part-time there for a little while, doing some work with their publishing group. And then I moved over to the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston and was doing the ephemera, the booklets, the member invitations, like all the kind of things that go along with printed things that go along with running a museum. And I was really books that were my focus, and publishing that was really my focus from the beginning of my museum career. And I wanted to continue doing that. So I actually left museums. I left the Gardner at that point. And I remember actually I should say maybe my one note of museum computing at the Gardner, we had a website that was very, very simple and very, very basic. And there was a webmaster or sort of an IT person in-house. I believe he's actually still there. But he didn't directly update the website. So when we needed it updated, we had to go through a contractor, and sort of I would do that process. I would kind of write out in longhand what changes I wanted made to what pages, that kind of thing. I would send it out. I would send that out, and it would get made. And then that was sort of the beginnings of museum computing for me, I guess. But that was just sort of a happenstance. It wasn't something I was looking to do at the time. I really was just into print books and museums generally. So I left the Gardner and to start a book publishing sort of company. And right when I did was when Amazon launched the Kindle, its first e-reading device, which is became very, very popular very, very quickly, with Amazon's sort of power behind it. And it really opened up the idea of e-book publishing and of digital publishing to the mainstream. I think there were a lot of efforts before that, stretching decades back before Amazon's Kindle came around, but really it was the Kindle that made all the big publishers take note, and all the small publishers also take note as well. And as a small publisher myself, just starting out, I thought ebooks were a great way for me to sort of expand my audience. And so I was doing ebook work, and so I started doing ebooks alongside my print books. But my real focus was on the books that were on visual art. And I was the only art book publisher doing ebooks. And that was a lonely place to be at that time, back in sort of 2008, 2009. And I wanted other people to do it as well. So I started looking for a community of museum publishers who might be interested in digital work. And that was, I attended my first MCN in 2011, and MW that year as well. Again, looking for community and wanting to sort of promote this idea of digital publishing to museum publishers. And so I loved the community that I was finding there and in other conferences. And I started doing that more and more. And I became a sort of de facto like digital publishing person for art museums. Like I would take lots of calls about what that was and what that looked like, what was digital publishing, how could we be more digital with our books. And sort of did a lot of speaking and kind of informal consulting around that area, and got more and more interested in that digital aspect of publishing, because of the recession, and it was harder to keep printing books, and holding a inventory of books and having that expense. And so ebooks let me go further than I could otherwise as an independent publisher. But I also just thought this sort of technology was super interesting as well. And so as sort of being outside of the museum world, but kind of participating in it a little bit, one of the things I saw early on was the OSCE program. So the Getty, before I was at the Getty in 2009, launched the Online Scholarly Catalog Initiative, which was a multi-year initiative with, I believe it was 8 museums, I should know the number, who the Getty Foundation gave money to explore the idea of putting their collection catalogs online. So that's known as OSCE, OSCI. And the idea at the time in 2009 was, the question was, could these things even go online? Like, these are these big printed collection volumes. They're basically like like the collections database, but printed out into a book, and then of course authored and added essays and provenance information, all kinds of other stuff on top of that. And they were expensive to produce, and they were out of date the moment that they were printed. And of course, once printed, you can't reprint something that expensive. So they weren't, having them in a print book was not very practical, but seemed so making them a digital seemed like a good answer, a good possibility. But at the time, museums participating in that initiative, there was a big question about, was that even, A, was it technically feasible? And B, was it sort of, was it going to be accepted by both curators and people inside the museum who are putting these books out, and also scholars who would be then researching from these things. So would a scholar accept a digital version of a catalog versus the printed version as the sort of authoritative and stable kind of thing? So that was a big early push into digital publishing on behalf of museums that really drove things forward. And that I was definitely watching. I remember seeing Liz Neely and I think Sam Quigley as well presenting on their work with OSCE at the Art Institute of Chicago early on at one of the conferences. So that was something I was watching sort of from outside at the time. And then the other thing that was happening in this space, again, before I got back into the museum world formally, was that the Apple launched the iPad in 2010. And all of a sudden there was this sort of amazing, beautiful device where it seemed like, for museums looking at the Kindle, which was an e-ink device, it's black and white, it doesn't do images very well, especially the early versions, they were very chunky and clunky. But here the iPad presented this really beautiful, full color, beautiful package that art museums especially began to think of themselves as seeing, like they could see their publications and their artwork as being desirable on an iPad, like on a device like that. Then all of a sudden ebook publishing or digital publishing became sort of more appealing. And then there were two tools that came out at the time as well. One was Ibooks Author, which was Apple's publishing tool. So, which enabled you to, it was a drag and drop. It made a sort of beautiful little package. You could do interactives, you could have videos, you could have different kinds of images. The design was really nice. And so it was really appealing and it was easy to use. So it was appealing for museums who were looking to do digital publishing as a kind of an easy way in to get their content onto a nice package and on a nice device. So that was really appealing, and some museums started experimenting with that. And then another tool was Adobe's digital publishing suite, which Adobe gave users a way to publish from InDesign, which is InDesign is a print publishing software that Adobe uses and that all book publishers use. But the digital publishing suite tool allowed you to take InDesign and actually publish an app to an iPad, to the App Store. And so that was really appealing for museum publishers they had designers who were familiar with InDesign and using that every day. By learning just a little bit more, they were all of a sudden able to put an app out, a digital publication that looked like an app, and again, had kind of all the bells and whistles and could be, sort of shiny and looked beautiful and pretty. And so some museums started experimenting with that as well. And so those were really the early in museum publishing. I think those were the things that we saw earliest. The OSCE cataloging initiative that was looking to publish things online directly, and then museums trying to get onto iPad specifically, and often using Ibooks Author and Adobe Digital Publishing Suite. So with those last tools for the iPad, one of the big problems that museums ran into within the first few years was that they were putting their content out in a proprietary way, like in proprietary platforms, and that where either Apple or Adobe or both were really controlling the distribution point there, that they were the only way to get there. So if you spend a lot of time doing an Ibooks Author thing and it didn't work, or whatever, you were kind of beholden to whatever Apple would or wouldn't do for you. And of course, then anyone who didn't have an iPad couldn't read that book or had no access to that content. So as a publisher, that starts to rankle a little bit, because as a publisher, you want to be something that you're putting the content out there for as long as possible, and in a way that's as as permanent and as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. So spending a lot of time just to get it onto one device owned by this mega corporation is not maybe a great long-term plan. Same thing with Adobe. They can change the rules at a moment's notice about how things are published. And Adobe's program, actually, you were required to pay a monthly fee for hosting. So as soon as they changed that fee, or you couldn't pay it anymore, whatever, your book was going to disappear from the App Store. And museums, I think, after experimenting, they liked the results, but they liked the results sort of as an individual publication, but they didn't like those sort of the distribution issues, and then these control issues about how we're serving these larger corporations and being sort of at the whims of these corporations. So I think after a few years, the Getty definitely did some of those projects as well. Others museums did. I know the MFA in Boston had done some, but everyone's largely at this point moved away from those tools. And I think now actually they've both maybe shuttered. I don't even think they're an option anymore for museums. That left a gap because there's still this question of where do we publish? How do we do really rich, illustrated, visually sort of driven books in a digital space? And I think, and so I think we turned back to, at that point, looking at the online, looking at sort of what are online, what can we do on the web that would make sense, because that was going to give us the most control, the most, the widest possible distribution, the most design control, everything about that seemed good. The one problem, of course, is that, or maybe not, of course, the one problem was the sort of money issue and the sort of, how do we monetize a book? If we can't afford to give it away for free, how do you monetize a website, essentially, if you're publishing to the web? Which is still an open question. I don't think we figured out. But yeah, Marty. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Let me jump in with just a quick historical question. What about publishing these catalogs on, say, CD-ROM or something like that? Was there a time period where people were promoting that?
That's an excellent question. I think there probably was. I think we look back, there was some CD-ROM publishing. I think I know that Getty, again, prior to me and prior to even my start in digital publishing at all, had published some CD-ROMs as part of print books, but I think they were mostly, it was less about the whole book. It was more like as supplements. So I don't know that anyone did anything that was like, this is the whole book on a CD-ROM. There's nothing else going with it. It tended to be more of like an additional thing on top of a print book. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, and actually I'd be, in sort of preparing for this interview, I started thinking about it and I was like, I should actually go back and look at the history, like, because I know there are things earlier than what I know of that were probably, being looked at and practiced, and I don't even know all of them, so it'd be interesting to do some more digging.
One of the reasons it popped into my head, Greg, is that a common theme we've heard with a lot of people telling stories about going onto the web for the first time is that for a lot of museum computing folks, it almost felt like a step backwards. They could do so much richer stuff on CD-ROM or in an in-gallery kiosk, right? Going to the web was, wow, we got limits with tiny little pictures and it's slow, right? So I was just wondering if there was similar pushback there.
Yeah, that's interesting. And yeah, I think by the time that we the time I'm talking about, I think by then the web had caught up and was like this, you could do a lot. I think I could certainly see that would, sort of a similar, I could see a sort of similar parallel to like this idea of doing these Ibooks Author or the digital publishing suite, and then thinking about having to do e-ink or Kindle or something like that, and like kind of like downgrading a little bit. For sure. And there's that same question with CD-ROM is like, well, then you need the right operating system to be able to operate that. And eventually those things, as we all know, those things disappear. And it's that same thing about thinking through longevity and like, what are we doing now? And do we want it to last? And if so, what are we doing to make it last? And in what format, right? Is it going to be, do we want is it okay if just the sort of content, the sort of core content of something last? Do we need the whole experience to last? Do we want the assets to be available, or those are going to go away? And kind of planning for that. And that's actually one of the things I could talk about. So the Online Scholarly Catalog Initiative, it wrapped up in sort of 2015-ish. At that point, all of the museums involved had published online successfully. Many of them have gone on since to publish even more, or are still planning on wanting to publish again in that format online. But at the very end, we published a report on that initiative. And one of the couple of the main findings of sort of the remaining challenges that came out of that, despite this, I mean, you have successes, you have people publishing these books, but they identified a few remaining challenges that they said. One was discoverability. So once we publish these catalogs, how do people continue to find them? One was around longevity, and there were sort of two aspects to longevity that that the group, sort of that cohort, that initiative cohort, identified. One was the longevity of how do we sustain the practice of digital publishing within our museum. So when the Getty's grant money goes away, how do we make sure that we can continue to publish books like this when we can't continue to make this in like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars of investment to publish these catalogs. And then longevity also, how do we, again, get back to that question of format and CD-ROMs and the web and all that, is how do we make these publications last a long time? More like a print book timescale rather than a website or microsite timescale, which are much different, obviously much different things. And then the third thing was around the sense of understanding the boundaries of these catalogs. So, one of the great features of the web, of course, is that you can surf it, that you can go from thing to thing to thing very easily, that you can follow a path of kind of links and ideas across sites, across institutions, through, into totally different areas very, very easily and quickly. We've all gotten lost down those rabbit holes. But when it comes to digital publishing and publishing a scholarly book, especially something that you want to be seen as an authoritative kind of object out in the world, how do we as sort of developers and engineers and designers, UX designers, how do we indicate the boundaries of that publication, that where, especially if you imagine a publication that we've put out online as a website, let's say it's been peer reviewed, how do we make sure that the reader knows that they haven't left some area and wandered off into some other part of our site that's not peer reviewed or that's not part of the publication? How do we make sure that they understand those boundaries and that they're comfortable with those boundaries as well? Because we want scholars to feel comfortable citing the books, knowing that the books are going to be there for a while and they're going to last a long time. So that all of these issues were still things that we were trying to tackle at the end of the OSCE program.
I just want to jump in and say I love that example, right? Because that notion of boundaries as defining something as authoritative, right? It's authoritative because it has boundaries to the knowledge. It's such a really interesting issue. And it's funny, you reminded me of some conversations I was having with people in the late 90s, I think it was, maybe at a Museums of the Web conference early on, where people explaining that this is one of the big problems that they have in their museum going online, is this idea of, where will the boundary be? Once we're online, somebody could jump from our museum to this museum to this museum and nobody would know.
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely the thing. And like, that's actually in many ways a desirable effect that you like now museum websites, especially at least within their own museum, they want people bouncing around. They want people to continue to find new resources and continue to sort of explore. But certainly there's, you want, in some cases, you want a limit to that, or you want to at least signpost for people, make it clear so they know where they are and they've left. And we want to be able to feel that we're providing a sort of authority, like that authority too, around the digital publishing. So I started at the Getty late 2013, sort of as OSCE was kind of nearing its final couple years there. And I was brought in, sort of charged with figuring out what was next. The Getty had done some of those experiments with Ibooks Author and using an app platform, not Adobe's, but someone else, a different kind, trying to figure out what digital publishing would look like at the Getty. And so I was brought in to kind of help figure that out. And early on, and one of the things was, of course, well, we want to do collection catalogs as well. Getty Museum proper was not actually part of the OSCE cohort formally. They kind of, because Getty's can't grant its own museum money to participate in a grant like that, but the Getty Museum followed along. They did do an initial publication, online publication as a sort of trial, but there was this sort of remaining question of what we were going to do next and how we were going to do it. So we really looked at that point, we had these collection catalogs, we knew we wanted to do them digitally, we knew we wanted to do other kinds of publishing and kind of push forward the boundaries of what digital publishing could be. And so we looked at those remaining challenges of that the OSCE cohort had kind of identified, of discoverability and longevity and objectness, or that sort of containerness of a book, digital book, and really try to build off of those things. So we've been working since then on what we now call Quire, which is Quire, which is a piece of software that is a multi-format software that publishes online, but also in PDF and ebook as well. And it's really geared towards the kind of rich visual scholarly publishing, so it's citations and deep zooming images and videos and audios, and we wanted to be able to handle all of that stuff. And so we've been working on that and sort of using our own books as prototypes and building out that software and identifying what a digital publication, a quire publication is, and where are the boundaries for that, and how do we manage that, and what do they look like, and all that kind of thing. And so we've been using all of our publications to kind of work toward understand, like building quire out with the idea that we're going to now work on open sourcing it to the community, so that others could also sort of take advantage. Again, getting back to that, trying to answer that question of sustaining a digital publishing practice inside a museum. We felt like if we could provide software that was relatively easy to use, and that we could provide a certain level of support for that software, that we could help other institutions continue digitally, publishing digitally, pushing forward that practice. Because we knew that the more, and this goes back to my own history as a sort of independent publisher looking for community and looking for other people to be doing this kind of work. So we know that the more people we can get doing this, the better we're all going to be at it, the richer the experience is going to be, the more new ideas are going to come out and all of that. So we've really been working towards that, and we're hoping to be able to sort of get that quire out as open source sometime in the next year or so. And this has all coincided very nicely, this move to the web for publishing. And I brought up that question of, or the issue of monetization before, and how do you pay for this? How do you do this? How do you make this, monetize a website if you need to sell it to sort of just to make a financial sense, just to break even. But all of this activity that's moved towards the web for digital publishing has coincided with, I think, a big push in the museum sphere of moving toward open access, open source, really thinking of the museum, generally museums' public mission, mission of public good, and trying to make their assets and their knowledge as open and as accessible as possible. And we've really been able to ride on that wave so the Getty has certainly supported us and continues just to do open access publishing. So not having to move away, being able to move away a little bit from the issue, the sort of financial issues, which is a real privilege, of course. And it doesn't work for every museum, but we're hoping that by providing tools like Quire and other ways, we can help answer some of those financial questions and bring the cost lower and lower, so that it becomes more a question of staff time and drive and being able than actually having to make a major investment in doing a publication. So that's kind of what we're after there, I guess.
I'm going to jump in and say that, it's, I think back to some of the conversations that I had way back in the day with Ken Hamma at the Getty about sort of the underlying philosophical shifts that were going to have to be made for museums to become more accepting of open access. I haven't talked to Ken Hamma in ages, but I like to think he's thinking about these changes over the past 20 years in a really positive way. We've really come a long way.
Yeah, we really haven't. Just in the last 5-7 years that I've been in the Getty, or 7, 8, almost 8 now. Gosh. It's definitely, I mean, when we first came in, we weren't talking about Creative Commons licensing. It wasn't even an option at that point. It really was, let's figure that out that we need to tackle this question of how do we sort of distribute these digital publications. But then it just shifted. I think that the museum leadership and got really very positive feedback from, every time you released collection images and that kind of thing. It was the positive feedback loop that came from users in the community out in the world and the world at large from doing those kinds of things really, I think, helped museum leadership sort of understand the value of that, and how well that kind of approach, that open approach, really blended well with the museum's sort of overall mission. I think that's a big part of it for sure. One of the things actually, so along with doing this sort of digital publishing, tackling the sort of rich digital publishing online that we've been doing. Another aspect of the work, and that started right after I got there at the Getty, was the open delivery and distribution of our backlist of titles. So publisher's backlist are all those books that a publisher has made and that maybe are out of print, or that are very old and hard to come by, maybe only available in a library, not readily accessible, and that kind of thing, that the things in the publisher's catalog that they don't really actively promote anymore for whatever reason. So publishers end up with a rich backlist. We have, I think Getty has now 1,200 different titles that we've published in the years. I think our first book was in 1954, and we've been publishing ever since. And that's a lot of books that are now, of course, not readily available on stores because they're out of print or they, for whatever reason. So we, along with a number of other institutions, I think Walters was one of the early ones. The Met did this as well. We started digitizing our backlist and making them available online for free download as PDFs mostly for individuals and institutions to use as they like. So there was a real push. I think right now what we call our virtual library is where we have these downloads available at the Getty. There's 300 some titles in there now, all available in PDF and free to use. The Met has even more. There's some rich resources so there was this sort of movement towards this opening our backlist and these sort of past things that was happening like simultaneously with other museums opening their collections images and really offering high resolution images for download for free, and doing that kind of work well. So that kind of, again, that's sort of the history of the move toward this openness to the assets that we used to, like images is a great example where museums often would charge for the rights to reproduce an image, to A, get a copy of an image, and B, reproduce it in some form. And museums use that as many museums saw that as a kind of money-making opportunity in a way of like helping the bottom line and sustaining their own practices in other areas of their institutions, which was sometimes valid, but oftentimes museums found that the costs of managing that process of having someone write in and ask for request an image and then get it back actually was costing them more than they were getting back in the fees. So now no one's winning, like every museum's is losing money. The people who are paying for the fees are losing money. So eventually they started figuring out that it was better just to just put them out in the open. It's goodwill. The images go much further. You get, you have much better coverage of where your images are, and you're better able to put out good quality images as well. So they better represent your institution and the artwork that they are of. So I think, that sort of movement towards open is really, we've benefited in digital publishing for sure. Yeah. What else can I talk about?
Well, I just wanted to pick up on what you just said right there about the. I often felt that is one of the big factors that led to the philosophical shift to encourage museums to support open access, because they saw how many poor quality images of their work of art were on the open internet, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, when you show a curator or director an image, Google image search for one of the star artworks, and there's just all kinds of stuff in there. It's a good motivator for sure, definitely. Yeah. What else? Oh, and so I guess I made some notes earlier. The other thing I could speak a little bit about in terms of that, the kind of other institutions working on digital publishing too, and kind of the community of people doing digital publishing. One thing, so after following the end of OSCE and sort of building off of our own work with Choir, a number of other institutions have continued publishing collection catalogs as well. And we got together with the Getty, National Gallery of Art in DC, Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the Art Institute of Chicago. We did a sort of very in-depth catalog study report, like a study on our collection catalogs to see, okay, after OSCE, after we've been producing these things, are they being received in the way that we intended them to be? How could we improve them? What could we do from that? And that sort of cross-institutional study, we published the results of that, but we also used the opportunity to coalesce a group called what we call the Museum Publishing Digital Interest Group, Museum Publishing Digital Interest Group, or MUPUDIG is what we call it. But it's kind of just as a way of like having a community of people together. It's something like there's 400 people registered for it. We have calls every other month where we kind of share ideas or have a speaker kind of present what they're doing. To try to continue to build this idea of the community around digital publishing and how specific digital publishing is in the museum sector versus other publishing arenas, where, for a major publisher that's publishing books out into the trade, like that you would see at Barnes and Noble or whatever, the Kindle is a great option, like moving to an ebook is a perfectly good thing. But with museums, we have all of this other stuff that we want to do. We want to kind of really push forward what an ebook can be, that it doesn't have to be something that you're just reading in black and white, and it can be something more or do more than what typically ebooks are doing now or can do now. So that's also been great. I think the working within the museum's sort of space has let us as publishers explore in new avenues much more than we would be able to if we were in sort of traditional publishing spheres. And it's nice that there's this community of people who are trying to figure that out, trying to see what can be done and how far we can go with it. So that's been good too.
Is there an overlap between that community and the community that's building this Choir open source project?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, definitely, the Choir, one of the reasons we started, and I could say that, one of the reasons when we started building Choir, it was because we looked around and didn't find a tool that already existed. I didn't come into the Getty thinking I'm going to build a tool. It was more like we identified how we wanted to address some of the challenges digital publications were facing. And then we went looking for a tool to help us with that. There was one out in the world that was sort of a nascent tool, but right as we were about to try it out, it kind of shut down. It was from an outside of the sector. It wasn't a museum thing. And so we were kind of faced with, well, if we want to build the kind of publications we better build the tool to help us do that and move in that direction. And then we started realizing, oh, well, others could benefit from this tool as well. So Choir is, at this point, it's one of the few things that addresses our sector, museum publishing, so specifically. So I think by default, it becomes, there's a number of the sort of in the museum publishing, that digital interest group. There are a number of people who are actively using Choir or who are talking about using Choir or have questions about Choir. So we actually try to, in many cases, I try to downplay Choir a little bit when I'm talking to that group because they hear enough about it. And I don't want them getting sick of us. So I'm very conscious of that, of being the sort of the one. I didn't want to be the only game in town. It happens to be at this time the game that addresses the issues most directly for people. So we'll see. I'm hoping other people will start to do it. In fact, actually, at the which museum is it now? Oh, it's the RISD Museum in Rhode Island. They have been, they've done a couple of digital publications. One was it was called Altered States, I believe, and it was built by hand, and it was the design's great. It's really interesting and unique. They went to do another publication called Raid the Icebox and started thinking about, sort of similarly to what we did at the Getty, was, how can we build off of what we learned with our first publication and on what we're doing now? How can we possibly package this in the future for others to use? So they're thinking also of like, how can we build a tool, or how can we take the work we're doing here at our institution and let others take advantage of that labor as well in some way, and thinking about it as an open source option. So there are some nascent other little things going on in this sphere, in this sector, that I think, I'm hopeful will produce some new and different kinds of options for people too.
It reminds me in many ways of like the history of a Mecca or similar tools, right? Where people were building things like they were at George Mason and saying, hey, we should release the back end for other people to use and do something similar.
Yeah.
On the one hand, I'm like, okay, this is a natural extension of all the work that the Getty has done with the Getty vocabularies and everything being that resource. On the other hand, I mean, it seems like an unusual role for a museum to play, to be developing open source software.
Yes.
I don't know what that says about the future of the museum world.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point. In fact, we had to do some thinking about that, and we're still sort of trying to address that. What does it mean to be a software publisher, and should museums be software publishers? I did a survey on open source work in general in museums a few years ago. It's sort of a side project that I was just interested in. I presented it at MCN, and I found that more than well over 100 museums are on GitHub, which is currently the primary source or primary sort of home base for open source and software. So there's tons of museums there, There's something like 1,600 different projects being represented on GitHub, and some that were public to some degree, but there wasn't a lot of active publishing of open source software, which takes another level. It's one thing to put something out on GitHub and make it available, but not really not with not a lot of instruction or support, or like not trying to build a community around that thing. But it's a whole nother thing to like actually want to publish open source software in a way that's sustainable and that sustains itself and will bring in new contributors and new participants into that community. It's a major task into itself. And that's one of the questions we've been trying to answer at the Getty with Choir and with a few other projects is, what does that look like in our space? How can we, is it sustainable? Is it something we want to do and that's useful to the field? And in fact, we hired, last year, we hired a community manager for Choir. We got some funding from within the Getty, some sort of internal funding to hire a couple of people dedicated to this idea of like, what would it look like to support Choir as an open source project to a bigger community? So we're trying to put some resources behind it and see how that plays out, because it's an open question. I think there's this sort of dream of open source and of the notion of, can museums do work that other museums can capitalize on? But how, is that a dream? Is it actually, achievable? What is that achievement? What does it look like to make that happen? I think are all pretty open questions. But then when I look at that sort of, when I was mapping out that open source community and trying to see what museums were doing, and you look at someone, you can look at an individual contributor and see that they maybe made, a couple dozen commits to some software project somewhere. And then you see that software project is being used by 3 or 4 institutions. And all of a sudden that was code work that doesn't need to happen in those 3 or 4 institutions, but it happened by this one person, this one institution. And like, if we can find tools and software that make sense to distribute that way and make sense that like are reusable across museums, I think the opportunity there is really great. And tantalizing. So I'm certainly hopeful, but we'll see. I think you're right that it's, is this something a museum can be?
I'm just loving the scope of the stories that you're telling, Greg, are really powerful, because talk about a behind the scenes look at digital publishing in museums, right? You've taken us from EPUB for art to online scholarly catalogs to open source software for museum publishing, right? I mean, and we've only covered about, what is that, 15 years maybe?
Yeah, something like that. That's exactly right.
That's a tremendous achievement.
Well, and it's remarkable that, yeah, when you say that, it's like, yeah, the Kindle came out in 2007, and I said that when I started with saying that was a sort of starting point. So yeah, that's 14 years. And so it's both remarkable how far things have come and how much we've moved and how much we've changed the way we've been thinking about digital publishing, but also the fact that we're really just in the beginning stages. Like, we've only been doing this for 14 years. Like, what will we achieve 14 years from now, or 44 years from now? I think that it's good to remember that we really are still just in the sort of nascent stages of it, for sure.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I really like too is that you've really hit upon the philosophical changes that have had to come along with the technology changes to make this acceptable. Is not the right word. I don't know what the word is I should be saying, but when you talk about issues of authority, for example, right, there could be a lot of people that lock down and say, well, if it's not in print, it doesn't count, right? We certainly hear those still in academia. But
yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think, yeah, that it's museum technology doesn't happen in a bubble. Like, it's technical work. It requires special skill. I think that that is not, but that the underlying drivers of that work are these bigger strategies and stances and tactics and ideas that float around the community that are really driving the work we do. Yeah, it's important to remember, for sure.